drugs as a society and culture. And so into that kind of cultural framework, if psychiatry comes along and says that our drugs work, and they're backed by huge amounts of money from pharmaceutical companies through funding of the American Psychiatric Association, through funding of the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, through funding of their thought leaders, and so on, funding of psychiatric departments, and so that they can create the image that they are a legitimate authority who has drugs that are safe, effective, that's going to work culturally. Part of the terrifying thing, or it should be terrifying for our culture and our society, is that increasing numbers of children who are just behaving well within the range of normal child behavior are being pathologized or being medicalized. So there are several examples of this. Most obvious for me, starting in 1980 with these oppositional defiant disorder, ODD. This sounds like you're pathologizing childhood, you're pathologizing rebellion, adolescent resistance, noncompliance. This seems highly problematic. Archives of General Psychiatry, a couple of years back, discovers that there's a 7-fold increase in children under 13 on antipsychotic drugs. Seroquel, Risperdal, Zyprexa, these heavily tranquilizing drugs. And they discover that the majority of these kids, around 63% of these kids, who are being put on antipsychotic drugs are not psychotic, but are diagnoses of these disruptive behavioral disorders like oppositional defiant disorder.
And you know something? The more you talk about your problems, the easier they are to solve. It's bottling things up inside that's bad.
As opposed to what real helpers, a more legitimate mental health profession, would be helping parents to learn how that you do form relationships where you can gain the level of respect in a way that you don't create resentment, and that these are normal phases, especially in adolescence, but also even younger for many of these kids, that if you deal with them right, you can strengthen family relationships. Legitimacy of psychiatry's process of how people are diagnosed is being called into question in major ways. It's not any longer just people who are dissonant mental health professionals who are speaking out against mainstream psychiatry. Mainstream psychiatry itself realizes they have gone so far, especially with the more recent DSM-5, where grief itself is now being pathologized, that people who are mainstream establishment psychiatrists, people like Thomas Insel, director of the National Institute of Mental Health, said in 2013, we're not going to be using the DSM, psychiatry's diagnostic Bible, anymore in our research. Alan Francis, who is the task force director of DSM-4, so embarrassed by this expansionism, this sort of imperialism of diagnoses, making fun of psychiatry as just being a tool for drug companies. The chair of the DSM-3 task force, a guy named Robert Spitzer, also embarrassed that psychiatry is no longer looking at the context of how these behaviors are happening, just taking a look at symptoms and needlessly pathologizing. So you're talking about three of the most major establishment psychiatry figures in the last 30 years. They are distancing themselves from the whole diagnostic procedure. So that's one aspect, to the extent that we can get across to the general public, that in terms of these diagnoses themselves, they're illegitimate scientifically. They have no value. They're not valid, and they're not reliable. Even if you believe in things like oppositional defiant disorder, it cannot be reliably diagnosed. Kids act differently with different people. There's no blood test, there's no EEG, there's nothing like that that stays consistent, and so their behaviors change. And so questioning the legitimacy of psychiatry's diagnostic procedures, and questioning the effectiveness of their treatment, which a lot of more establishment psychiatrists, psychologists are willing to do nowadays. It's more mainstream to question the fact that antidepressants don't seem to work in aggregate much better than placebo sugar pills. People have now delegitimized a lot of these biochemical imbalance theories. It's more mainstream establishment psychiatrists like Ronald Pease have talked about, like, well, this stuff is just, we've always known it's urban legend, that there is no biochemical brain imbalance theory. The major theory that, by the way, was used to sell all of these serotonin reuptake inhibitor type of drugs like Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft. So on many areas, one aspect, one prong of changing it all is getting across to the general public that even establishment psychiatry figures are now embarrassed by the lack of science in psychiatry, and it really has not it is not to be seen as a legitimate scientific pursuit.